Good afternoon. My name is Alicia Wimbush. I am the Program Director of Religious Leaders at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. I would like to thank each of you for joining us for this afternoon's Lunch and Learn, providing spiritual care for religiously unaffiliated individuals. And again, as you are coming in, I ask that you would put your name in the chat box. You can put your organization in which you're working in, and also the state that you're Zooming in from. We love to see who's in our community today with us. During the discussion, we ask that you would mute your microphones. We will have time for Q&A with our guest, and you can submit your questions to ICJS staff. You'll see in the Dropbox, it says submit questions here. So throughout our conversation, you can feel free to send your questions there. And again, we will have time to get to as many questions as we can. And so today we have the pleasure of being in conversation with Reverend Dr. Susan Pizer Yoder, affectionately called Sue. And I want to introduce her very briefly. She is a native of Butler, Pennsylvania, and she received her degrees from Westminster College, Pittsburgh Seminary, and Louisville Seminary. And today actually marks her 40th pastoral anniversary. So glad you're here with us, Sue, on this anniversary. She brings a lot of wisdom into this conversation. So we're glad to have her here. In 2005, she founded the Barn Faith Community, which is an intergenerational, innovative new church development of the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA. And she is currently planting 1,001 new worshiping community through PCUSA called Blank Slate. And this community focuses on conversations with individuals with no religious affiliation, and also individuals who are done with institutional religion, as typically expressed in the United States. And last year, she and a group of colleagues wrote a book called Hear Us Out. And this book talks about those conversations that she's been in with individuals who are no longer affiliating with a particular religious tradition. And so today she is going to share about this work, about this book, Hear Us Out, that she co-wrote with her colleagues, and offer us insight about how spiritual care providers can better serve this growing community. And so, Sue, we are so glad that you are here with us, and I look forward to this conversation with you. So I would love to start us off. Like I said, you are celebrating your 40th anniversary in pastoral ministry, and I can imagine that you have seen a lot of changes over the years. And so I would love for you to reflect on, as you have seen the landscape of religion changing in the United States, how has that impacted your ministry and how you do ministry?
Well, there has been a lot of change. I think much of what I learned in seminary has some of the basics of faith have remained the same, but how we do ministry has done a 180-degree shift. I think we certainly in ministry have many more people outside the church looking in. When I first started ministry, there were many more people in the church. And that has been one major change. I think another major change has been perhaps that there are more extremes in religion than there were. There was more a mainline kind of faith paradigm, that now there are people who are much more extreme and much more at odds, even within the faith community, with one another. So I think that is another really big change that I see.
Mhm. And so how would you say that has impacted how you're doing ministry now?
That's a wonderful question, Alicia. I think the way I do ministry now is very relationally based. It doesn't assume anything. It doesn't assume people know the basics of faith. It doesn't assume people know our sacred text. I don't make any assumptions, and I have found that to serve me well. And I think the other thing that's really changed in the way I do ministry is that I have learned to listen better and to ask more questions and to get more curious about where people are, to lean in, assuming nothing, and let them tell me their story. I think we have found how important it is to hear the other's story out and not assume you know their story,
Yeah.
but to really hear their story. And sometimes that's a story of a rich faith tradition. Sometimes that's a story of incredible pain.
Mm,
They've been hurt by the church, the synagogue, the mosque. Sometimes that is a story that's very mixed. Sometimes it's a story of their walking away, but not from God, but from the church or the institutional setting. And when you listen to their story and you ask questions, people are very willing to share more and more and more with you about where they are and how they got there if they don't feel judged, if they just feel received and loved.
mm. Oh, that's wonderful. And I think as spiritual care providers, we understand the impact of that story. So I appreciate you just bringing up how stories, they connect us. And sometimes, we just have to take that time to really listen. So stories are very key in ministry.
Mhm.
I would love for you to share with us what was really the catalyst for you to really begin doing some research and having more conversations with people who are outside of mainline churches or outside of any religious institution. What kind of sparked that interest for you?
But back in the late 90s, 2000, I was doing doctoral research and I was noticing that within churches, um, people tended to either be gray heads, or I'd go to another church and it would be boomers, or I'd go to well, very seldom did I go to a church and see people younger. And so I started to say, well, why are just the gray heads going over here and the boomers are going here, but they're not mixing much. There's not much intergenerational. And I really wanted to explore this sense of intergenerational ministry. Was it still possible? Right. And what I realized that was that for the first time in history, we had three different methods of communicating. Isn't this interesting? Amongst the generations. There had always been maybe one shift, but now there were three shifts. So the gray heads, they were the information generation that really read. They read the newspaper, they read newsletters, they read articles, they read the Bible, they read, right? And then all of a sudden, boomers came along and they didn't read so much because they had this new thing, this newfangled thing called the television. And they began to have a common experience. And that common experience was what was happening on TV. Because unlike today, right, we had CBS, NBC, ABC, local educational channel. That was it. There was four of them. And so we had sort of the same storyline that we were learning. So all of a sudden, experience and this storyline, this common storyline became our way of communicating. And then following boomers, we begin to see the beginning and onset of massive amounts of technology. And so now it wasn't even a storyline, there were thousands of storylines and technology took over. So all of a sudden, the gray heads would have pastors who were reading from the word of God, sending them newsletters, right? The boomers were doing all kinds of experiential stuff in their churches, right? And we weren't seeing the next generation. So what I was exploring was, given that there's three different primary communication methods, can we bring them together? And that's what we experimented with in the barn. Can we bring them together in a worship setting and give everybody a little bit of what they're looking for, but nobody gets everything of what they're looking for, right? So that's what we did. We explored that. We experimented with that. But in the process of that, I found that 2/3 of people in the United States were no longer worshiping in a community. This is back in 2000. And I said, this can't be. This just can't be. They were not regularly worshiping, but they were believers in God. And so that's what really started this search for me. I thought, wow, that's the majority. Here's the church really ministering to the minority in our country now, as opposed to the majority, right? And I read this wonderful book called Blue Ocean Strategy. And what it was saying was everybody's fighting over the same people. So, First Church was saying, oh, we gained 20 new members, but they weren't new members. They were from the church down the street that just closed. Or this church had, 10 new members. Well, it wasn't again 10 new people to faith. It was 10 people who were there because the organist and pastor had an affair. Right. So what was happening was it was aquarium jumping, right? They were just jumping from aquarium to aquarium, but nobody was going out into the ocean where the far majority of the fish lied. So I really felt called to, not because I didn't love the traditional church that I served for 20 years, but because I felt like there were so few people who were feeling called to go out into the ocean and explore the fish in the ocean and really get a sense of Why are people leaving the institutional setting? And what are they looking for? And that was the venture that I went on.
Yes. And you took some colleagues with you on this venture of exploring what does spirituality look like outside of religious traditions, outside of the church, a mosque, or a synagogue, or a temple. And so I would love for you to share a little bit about this group that you brought together in 2018. How did you come together? What was the mission and the vision of you all collaborating on this book, Hear Us Out?
Sure. It was the first time in my life where I didn't have the responsibilities of kids at home too. So I had a block of time because my kids had left the nest. And I had a block of time and I thought, boy, if I was a young pastor, if I was a 20 something, coming out of seminary, and I wanted to be effectively pastoring to people today, I would want to understand these emerging generations. I would want to understand they're not coming to worship by and large, they're not coming to worship. I would want to understand why not. But I would not have the time to do that research. I would
Mm.
not have the time to dig deep. So we applied to Louisville Institute for a grant, and we were blessed to receive that grant. And I asked a group of colleagues from all different denominations, UCC, Evangelical Free, Moravian, Baptist, Methodist, I mean, this whole group, rabbi. I ask all these people to come alongside me and say, are you as curious as I am about how people are making meaning? Because for those of us who are of a certain age, we made our meaning often in the church, right? It was the place of hatch, match, dispatch. It was the place where we hatched the new lives, right? We matched up in partnering and marriage, and then we dispatched to the next life, in funerals and I'm like, if they're not going and they don't have this community, how are they making meaning? What's making sense to them? How are they answering life's big questions, right? And so my colleagues were as curious as I was. And so we brought together this group. We lost a few along the way, not to the research, but to life and its circumstances. So there ended up about 8 of us. We started with about 12 of us. And we just researched how are they making meaning. We ask important questions, which are the basis of the book. We asked them questions. First of all, we interviewed about 225 nuns and duns, no religious affiliation when asked, or kind of done with institutional expressions of a religion. And we asked them questions like, tell us about a place where you belong.
Mm.
Have you met up with a challenge or a really difficult part of life, and how did that change you? How did that shape who you are? We asked them, what do you think comes next? Like what happens? What do you want your legacy to be? So we devised these questions very specifically, not to be religious, churchy kind of questions, right? But the kind my computer, I don't know why it does this, but it does that. Like it's a setting that I didn't set up that somehow magically appear. Look what happens here. Like I do this and watch. I figured that one out. I don't know why it does all that. Somebody's gonna have to tell me how to take that off my computer because I talk with my hands all the time.
I love it. It was so beautiful, little confetti.
Anyways, where was I? So we have all these colleagues, right? We're researching, we're trying to understand how they're making meaning, and we're trying to do it in the way we ask the questions to just be very open-ended and to invite their stories and for them to disclose what they wanted and the amount that they wanted. And we were so blown out of the water
Mm.
because not only did they answer the questions, but and I did over half the interviews myself and my colleagues did the other half the interviews. But when I started the interviews, we had these 5 questions and then they're all like, but you ask us to come and be interviewed because we're nuns and duns. And you haven't asked us why we're nuns and duns. And we want to tell you, like, I'm prepared. I want to tell you why I'm a nun and dun. And we said, well, we didn't want to ask you overtly religious questions or pride. No, we want to tell you. So we said, okay, we'll ask that question, but we're going to tell everybody that we're not the ones asking. You wanted us to ask this question. So that's what we did when we asked the question. And that last question was, where are you in your faith journey of growing up and how has that changed in terms of where you are today? And then they shared very openly about that. But this is the fun thing that happened. You'd ask these questions and they'd be like, these are important questions and I've not thought about these things and I want to think about these things.
Yes.
I had 2 or 3 people say to me, if in my church, in my synagogue, one was a Jew, a couple were Christian, if they had asked these kinds of questions and they were open to my answers, I'd still be there.
Mm.
Isn't that interesting? Right?
Yeah.
And we just ask the questions and we ask them uniformly. I'd talk with people before, I'd say, but as soon as I press this record button, I'm going to ask you these questions and I can't give you input. I can't say, tell me more, like I want to know more, but I can't, because we got to keep them all uniform and all the same. And it was amazing, the responses, the stories that they told us, the feedback that they gave us, the honesty and integrity with which they answered the questions. And then our team was like, we got to write a book. We got to let people understand what we've learned and how these generations are making meaning and what's important to them and what they're struggling with. So consequently, we wrote the book Hear Us Out, because the title is really Hear Us Out. In other words, we want you to understand us. Hear us out. Hear how we're feeling or not feeling about God. And we learned some fascinating things, and I'm glad to share, whatever of that you'd like me to.
Yes, I would love to hear. A lot of other questions are bubbling up in my mind. I would love to hear what were some of those responses as far as why people were leaving religious institutions. If you could share kind of what kind of came up. Was there a theme? Um, yeah, I would love to hear about that.
Absolutely. So it was very interesting to us that what we discovered more or less was that emerging generations weren't leaving the church as much as they felt the church and synagogue and mosque had abandoned them. It's very interesting. And what I mean by that is, big signs that say all are welcome. Okay, but we're interviewing them and they're saying, yeah, and if I'm in the LGBT community, well, maybe not you. If I'm a person of color, well, you don't kind of fit in with how we look. If I'm an immigrant, well, not so certain that we got a real place for you. And what they were saying is, don't put a sign in your yard. There are very authentic generations, both the iGen and the millennials. Don't put signs in your yard that say all are welcome. And then I bring my gay friend and you say, not so much, right? They feel as though in many ways, I think they are very open to spirituality. I think they're very open, our experience, to conversations about God and life and what matters and all those kinds of things. But they want to think independently. They don't want somebody preaching at them, declaring the dogma that they must sign on the line in order to be a member of this particular faith community. They want to struggle with things. They want to wrestle with theology. They want to be able to deconstruct
Mm.
and reconstruct, right? If that makes sense. Like deconstruct theology, what it is they believe. They want to ask good questions about that. They want to say, well, yeah, I can buy this, but I don't buy that. And they want the church, the synagogue, the mosque to own its stuff.
Mm.
So in other words, if we contributed to slavery, if we contributed to the killing of indigenous people, if we contributed to the diminishment of women, they're not saying, I'm going to hold you personally accountable for this. But what they are saying is own this stuff and own that it was wrong and show me how it's going to change moving forward. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It
So
does.
so there's this transparency and honesty among these generations that they just don't take the party line.
Mm.
They don't want the party line. They want to claim what they believe. They want to own what they don't. They want to be free to ask. Like this one guy I interviewed, for instance, he's an atheist, very confirmed atheist. I don't buy it. I don't believe it, everything else. By the end of our interview, and then I shut off the recording and we kept talking for a while. He said this in all honesty. He said to me, Sue, if I had ever been in a faith community that was as engaging and open and willing to hear from me as you are, I would still be there. I haven't found that. I haven't found a place where I could genuinely struggle. What I was told was quit asking questions, just listen and take notes. You're a troublemaker. Be quiet, right? Instead of, that is a great question. Let's go there. Let's look at that. Let's talk about that. That kind of summarizes this generation, right? They have every ounce of information at their fingertips on this little thing. And
Mhm.
all they have to do is, like, I sat, this was before the interviews. I had a group of nuns and duns at my table and I was just interviewing them. And I said, well, we kind of went to church for a lot of different things, but I said, where do you go when you like have questions or, mystery or whatever? Well, we just ask Google.
Google.
That was their
Yeah.
question. That was their answer, right? We asked Google. And I'm like, that's kind of interesting because I don't think of my faith community as the place I went to get answers to my questions. I thought of it as a place where I could explore mystery and I could ask good questions and I didn't have to have answers, but I had fellow journeyers along the way with me. None of them experienced church, synagogue, mosque like that. Isn't that interesting? So I think these are important learnings for us. If we want emerging generations, we have to create safe spaces, non-judgmental spaces, spaces where we can say, this is what the church has traditionally believed. This is why, this is how we got there. What do you think?
Mm.
That is a very different way of approaching our faith. But boy, for them, when they find that that's real and that's alive and that's engaging and that's something that they will embrace. Does that help answer that question, Alicia?
Yes, it does. And as a 40-year-old, I definitely resonate with going to church and wanting to ask questions, but it not being a safe space to do that. And so I think even in your interviewing process, I love how you talk. These are our conversation partners. I love that you opened up with these big questions that people really do want to wrestle with. And so just the space that you created for people to really think deeply about what's bringing them meaning? How do they go through struggle? One thing that I appreciated about the book is you talked about you weren't having these conversations to try to change anybody, convert anybody. You really were wanting to listen to their stories. And I think as spiritual care providers, one of the things I love about chaplaincy and offering spiritual care is we are there to really listen to people's stories and find out how they're making meaning in their life, and connect them to those resources when they feel like they're in crisis or they don't have a sense of belonging. And so that's one thing I loved about your approach in this book is you were really wanting to hear them out, hear this community out. So
Alicia, let me go back to a word that was really important that you just said, because I think this is worth commenting to those of you in this profession doing this important work, and that's the word belonging. It was overwhelming to me that when we asked the question, tell me about a place where you feel you belong, that 10% said nowhere.
mm,
And then there was this other large group of the population that said, so the number one answer was their family of origin. Okay. But for a number of them, when they came out and expressed who they really were, their family rejected them. And then they had to go find a chosen family because they
mm,
no longer belonged in the one place where they belonged, which was incredibly painful, right? To hear those stories. And interestingly, this whole concept of belonging, right? We all need a place where we can belong, where we feel like we are loved, like through and through, love, right? Like that's the blessing, right? That somebody gives us this message, you are loved just because you are, like, period, like end of sentence, right? So a lot of people had to find a community, a chosen family, a chosen community. But this whole sense of belonging, I found it fascinating how many of them related to Fred Rogers, right?
interesting.
I love you just the way you are. Fred Rogers was one of my professors in seminary. I love you just the way you are, right? And this sense of, boy, if the church could create, if the synagogue could create, if the mosque could create, or the Gurdwara could create a place of belonging, and I talk about it in the book. It's one of the chapters that I wrote. This place of koinonia,
Mm,
this for Christians, this New Testament word that we translate fellowship, but man, not fellowship as in we go have a cookie and a cup of coffee, not that kind of fellowship, but the basis of that word in Greek, this sense of a safe place, right? Creating koinonia, a safe place where I can show you the good, the bad, and the ugly in myself, and I will still be loved. So I can share with you my successes and my failures. I can share with you my joys and my problems. I can share all of me in this place. And in this place, I am not judged, but loved. I am encouraged. I am built up. When I fall, people are there to pick me up. And so many people, period, but particularly among these generations who have the highest suicide, highest anxiety, highest depression rates on record, how desperately they need a place of koinonia. That's what Blank Slate's doing, right? Like we have 13 different groups of like a dozen people where we are creating koinonia, a safe place to explore what they believe, a safe place to make meaning, a safe place to talk about their spirituality and God, right? And chaplains can do that even with the hospital staff or, a group of people. This creating this sense of koinonia where it's a true place where when I show you my warts and all, I still belong here. And that I cannot tell you how, if there is one truth that we learned, it's how desperately people need that in their life.
That's wonderful. One of the things that we've been talking about at the ICGS is this sense of belonging and creating that community, an interfaith community where people feel like I can bring my whole self, my spirituality, even if I don't necessarily have a particular religious tradition, I can bring that into this space and know that I belong here and that I'm seen. And so that is so important. That's what one of the primary needs of all human beings is that sense of belonging.
And
So,
God knows it, right?
yes.
God knows it. That's why God says, and you belong to me. Now, we may express that differently, right? And that's okay. We may express it differently. But the fact that we trust a God who says, yes, and you belong to me, you belong here in my presence. That is the greatest gift that we can give
Mm.
to these emerging, well, to anybody, but particularly to these emerging generations who are having such a hard time feeling safe anywhere.
Yes, yeah. So I know you did these interviews during the pandemic and you talk about the suicide rates, the depression, the sense of loneliness. Did you see people really struggling as you were having these conversations with the pandemic and finding that sense of belonging, since we all had to, isolate and not be with our family?
Absolutely, they were, and they did. And I think, it's one thing for people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, right, who have kind of established community, have kind of established their sense of self and all that kind of stuff. But for young people who are still trying to figure out, who am I? Where do I belong? How do I fit? And and being shut off in school and I mean, it was very, very difficult, and some of them openly talked about it, just how tough it was for them, and particularly those who didn't have a place where they really felt like they belonged, or just entering the workforce and now all of a sudden they're working from home. It was very, very difficult on these emerging generations, and again, they were very open in talking about it. I think this generation is more open about talking about their mental health
Mm.
than previous generations. I mean, they'll talk openly about it. They'll talk openly about their therapists, their anxiety, that kind of stuff, where previous generations were kind of like, don't air your dirty laundry. Like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get tough. Not this generation. This generation's like, I got to see my therapist, you know? And so they have this openness to receiving help. The other thing they have, and this is very interesting that we learned, they are more open to being mentored than any previous generation. And by mentored, I mean not apprenticed, as in I've kind of arrived at the culmination of my career and I'm going to teach you everything I know. Not that kind of apprenticing, but mentoring, as in walking alongside somebody, particularly older adults, is who they're most open to this with, and walking alongside those mentors with an equal give and take,
Mm.
recognizing that each one has something to offer the other. So they come to the relationship as equals and are kind of offering each other something important. And we found that they were more, and if I was in a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a gurdwara with some wonderfully balanced older adults who are open and caring and loving and sensitive, man, I would be starting a mentoring program, is one of the things I'd be doing, right? Because there's this openness to the mentoring And it would be outside of the church. It would be outside of the worshiping faith community, most likely, but creating the atmosphere where older and younger can be together and learn from one another and grow with one another.
I think that's one thing that is missing in our community, that intergenerational exchange. And I love how you talked about there's a mutuality there. It's not one person saying, I know it all. I can teach you this, but really that sense of, no, we can learn from each other. And so you mentioned very briefly this community called Blank Slate, and also another intergenerational community you created, Barn. Can you speak about both of those communities and how they are similar, how they're different? But I think they both kind of speak to this intergenerational community that you have created, specifically with those who are not necessarily wanting to be a part of a religious tradition.
Yeah, so they're both
Yes.
very different, and they were meant to be. My calling in for the last 20 years has really been to explore what I would call the not yet future church.
Mm.
Right? We don't really know what form. We know it's not going to take the form it has for a while because our churches are closing daily. But we also aren't sure what it's going to look like. So my calling in recent years has been to take the best of what I experienced in the institutional setting, and I was really privileged to serve some amazing communities. Take the best of that and then come over and say, okay, if this isn't how it's going to look, what is it going to look like? What are people looking for, right? So with the barn, I began asking people, do you have a faith community? And if they said yes, tell me about it. And I found what they liked about it, etc. If they said no, I said, well, why not? Are you a spiritual person? If they said yes, well, tell me about that, right? And then I'd say, what doesn't appeal to you about, because there's a church on every street corner, there's a mosque on every, I mean, they're all over the place. You have your choice. And they'd tell me. And I started making a list, and I started hearing the same things over and over and over again. And so I formed the barn around that which people were looking for that they weren't finding in institutional settings. A couple of the things that they weren't finding. A lot of times people didn't find that the worship was touching their everyday life. They felt like it was kind of like you go into another world and then you kind of leave. But where is the life that I live every day? Where's the application? Where is the connect between my life and my faith life? Like, how do these integrate? So we tried to do a lot of integration. Number two, I think a lot of people felt like how they loved God and how they loved neighbor were kind of compartmentalized and two separate things, right? Like, oh, well, the mission team does that, the evangelism team, but I don't have to do that. And I think people were looking for an integration that the love of neighbor and the care of neighbor was in fact intricately connected to the love of God. So that love of God and love of neighbor, which, all our faiths hold in common, right? This weren't two different tracks that some people did this while other people, they were one and the same. To love God is to love neighbor. So from the very beginning in the barn, we engaged neighbor, like from the very beginning, and not neighbor as in, I'm going to go help those poor people, those poor lost people, those poor people, no, our neighbor was our equal. We were walking alongside because we had a certain set of skills or gifts or resources, and they had another set of skills and resources, right? And we saw one another as partners, right? That were working together, not as us helping them. It wasn't an us, them, it was a we and. So that was an important. Another thing that was really important was the arts. I found so many artists that said, man, if you don't sing in a choir or play an organ, like, what about the visual artists? What about the poets? What about, right? Like all these various artists who were craving a place where they could get in touch with God through the arts. And so we had this big arts team that just did all kinds of creative, well, Alicia Wimbush came and danced several times
I
for
did.
us. Dance, art, drama, all these things. And we used available things like clips from movies and artistry pieces that people made. And so we utilized the art. So we were creating a community where everybody was involved. Everybody brought their skill set, to the table, but it was still Christocentric and it was still worship centric. That was Blank Slate. So it found a lot of alternative ways and drew a lot of people in. But then I was like, okay, what about the people who aren't necessarily Christocentric, people who don't know what they believe, people who are seeking out after meaning, people who want to have interfaith dialogue, like your right? So I said, we gotta go another step, right? Like, how do we do that? So then we started Blank Slate, and its name is intentional, right? Like, here you can start with a blank slate. Here you don't have to know what you believe or why you believe it. Here you can come with, I come as a person of Christian faith, and they know that. But I welcome people of all different faiths. I've got Buddhists, I've got agnostics, I've got atheists, I've got Jews, I've got Sikhs, I've got them all, like, right? Like, and participating and having these wonderful live meaningful conversations about what people believe, because we're not threatened by what the other person believes. We rejoice that they have found meaning in what it is they believe. And we find, oh, my faith tradition never taught me that, but boy, that would be a really rich resource that would make my faith even richer, right? And so Blank Slate is, we don't like our groups to be larger than 12 to 15, because then it's no longer an intimate kind of setting. And we have, I think currently we have 13 of these groups right now that are meeting. Like Leisha leads one on dance and movement and how that can affect us and our spiritual reality. We have a music group. We have a movies group that watch deep, powerful movies, and then we talk about the meaning in that in our life. We have groups that delve into books. So all of these different groups, they're deepening what they believe. They're finding a safe place of koinonia with which to explore what it is they believe. And they're also finding a rich appreciation for people who think differently than they do. Instead of being threatened by them, they're welcoming them.
And so how important is that in the day and age we're living in, that people are actually seeing the differences and celebrating those differences
Mm.
and recognizing we don't have to feel threatened. We don't have to have that fear of, oh, somebody is different than me. And so I can't talk with them. And so that's what I love about these communities you're creating is you're saying, no, we need to hear each other's stories. We need to hear how we're making meaning so that we can learn with and from each other. And so I just appreciate these spaces that you have been able to create. We have some amazing questions. I haven't gotten to all my questions, but I want to get to the community questions. They're coming in as we're talking. And so one question from the community that I would love for you to reflect on, I'm going back to the book and the interviews that you were able to do, is what did you learn from your interviews about those who have been traumatized by their faith tradition or their local houses of worship? And then what are some ways that we can best serve those who have been traumatized? I don't know if that came up in any of
Mm.
the conversation that you had, but please share about that.
Yeah, a lot of people were traumatized, and that is why they are nuns and duns, right? I think one of the main things that I learned was the importance of listening the whole way through, listening to their story and their pain the whole way through. And though I didn't personally cause the pain, to be able to say, I am profoundly sad and I am profoundly sorry that this happened to you. And it's kind of like that old thing when people say, I don't believe in your Jesus or your Buddha or whatever it is, right? And you say, well, tell me what it is that you've heard about him. And then they tell you all this stuff and you say, well, I don't believe in that Jesus either. I don't believe in that Buddha either, right? Because sometimes it's so distorted, right? And some of these people have had such distortion put upon them. Some of them were sexually abused, by priests and pastors. I mean, there's so many things that happen. The LGBT community and the pain that they have experienced is unfathomable. I mean, I can go on with the list, but to listen to their stories the whole way through, and just for my little part to be able to say, I am so profoundly sad this happened, and they'll say, nobody has ever said that to me. Right. So they're holding this pain. And to be able to say, I can understand why you feel and have experienced all of this. But may I just say to you that these are humans. And I hope at some point you can make a distinction between what humans have done to you and a God who loves you very much. And if there's only one little God sentence, I would say that would be the sentence, because so often we can't distinguish, right? Because when a person in the name of God does something to us,
Yes.
it's abusive or horrible, we can't psychologically, we can't break that down and apart often until somebody helps us. And I really encourage them to work through their story to a place of healing. So I think as caregivers and chaplains and people who are doing this work, to really, when somebody gives you, because people don't come out and say, oh, I mean, occasionally they do, but usually they give you a little snippet, and they're basically saying, do you want to know? And it's when you listen and you hear that snippet and say, oh, I heard something in your voice that sounds like you had a bad experience. Do you want to say more about that? And as soon as we listen non-judgmentally and non-defensively, right, they'll tell you more and more and more. And pretty soon you've established a relationship from which you can begin to maybe help with some healing.
Yes. And Sue, I thank you for that response. And I know as chaplains, spiritual care providers, sometimes when we're meeting with people, because people may have had a negative experience within their religious tradition, they might close off seeing or hearing or getting a visit from a chaplain. And so I think it's important for us to be aware of that some people have been traumatized or had negative experiences, and for us to be that presence to say, tell me about that experience. And be that non-judgmental presence, and maybe even being a healing presence for them. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind as we're providing spiritual care.
Mhm.
Another question from the community is, they said, I appreciate your focus on koinonia. As a chaplain, I don't always have the luxury of long-term relationships with people. I meet them for a moment in their life. How can I create that deep fellowship in a short amount of time? And often it's a very, very hard time for people.
Yeah, yeah. Because they're traumatized, you find you're pastoring with them in a time of trauma. Um, you know, w- w- I'm thinking off the top of my head right now, but were I a chaplain in a kind of setting where people are they're sharing, there's this little bit, they start to open up. I would have like a group at the hospital or the home or wherever, where I said, when you're out of here and things start to sort through, I just want you to know that we have a group where we're exploring meaning and we're doing, and I would, in other words, it's a follow-up, right? Where you could have that. You could have that kind of a koinonia group where they could return to the hospital or whatever. Now, if they're from out of the area, one of the things that I encourage people to do that can't participate in Blank Slate is to find another person with whom they feel safe and to regularly meet.
Mm.
So whether they go out for breakfast once a week or, whatever, find somebody with whom you can be your most honest, vulnerable, true self, and really intentionally create that kind of environment. I had to do this for myself as a pastor, right? Because it's not appropriate for me to be doing this level of sharing, with some of the groups, my own stuff. So I went and found, I have two groups of women and we meet regularly to do this. So we have to find a way to create this space, to be vulnerable, to open ourselves up, to experience koinonia, because man, it makes all the difference. It makes all the difference because you're free to be you when you find this kind of koinonia. So yes, find it, create it somehow, be as creative as you can, encourage people to find a person with whom, and if they can't find a person, for goodness sakes, then go to therapy, but find right? Like find a way to be able to be your most authentic, true self and to explore who you are and who you are in the sight of the God that loves you. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I think it's helpful as chaplains, like this person is pointing out, we don't always have days to meet with somebody. Sometimes it's a one visit, and to be able to know the resources within their community, like you said, to say, is there one person that you can talk to after you leave the hospital or after you leave the shelter? And so I think it's helpful as chaplains, we begin to build up our own toolkit of resources we can point people to, because we might not always be that space where they can have that deep fellowship. And so and that's okay, and that's okay.
Mother Teresa said something that will be with me until I leave the earth. She said, I can do no great thing. I can only do small things with great love.
Mm.
I think we should never underestimate the power of a conversation, right? The power that we have in that brief half-hour encounter or whatever it is, to say some things that will stay with that person, to make them think, to invite them to the next step, to value them in the way we treat them and accept them in the way we treat them. I don't think we should ever underestimate the value of that.
Yes. There's something else you talked about, even being our authentic self, and
Mhm.
how that allows other people to be their authentic self. And so, even as spiritual care providers, of course, we can't divulge all that we have been through or are going through, but there's a way in which that we can be our authentic self in those positions, and hopefully that allows other people to feel like, you know what, I can be myself in this encounter and really, experience that fellowship. We're getting some great questions in here, Sue. I wish we could get to all of them. But another question that we have, and this is specifically talking about the conversations that you had in the book. They said, I love the questions that you asked. How do you go about formulating questions? And I know as chaplains, as spiritual care providers, we ask a lot of questions. That's something that's in our toolkit. What's a good question that you have been asked before that you weren't expecting?
Oh, I don't know if I can think of one. It takes a lot, as you know, Alicia, to surprise me. People ask me the most random of things, and I'm just kind of like this open book, so it doesn't like very little surprises me. I'm not sure that I can think. Like literally, you could ask me anything, and I would. I mean, you know me. I would respond. So, I'm trying to think of a time when I was surprised by a question somebody asked me, and I honestly can't think of one in the moment. Uh, and maybe that just has to do with by nature, I'm a very curious
Yes.
person,
Yeah.
right? By nature, I'm a very curious person. When people ask me curious questions, the more curious, the more I'm in, right?
Mhm.
Like, the more odd the question, I'm like, oh, I've never been asked that before. That's awesome. Like, I'm like totally in. So I think part of that has to do with like, I can't think of a time when I've been asked a question where I've said, sorry, not going to answer that. I'll find a way to answer the question because I want to invite disclosure and invite the authentic self. Yeah,
Yes.
I'm sorry to the answer of the question. I'm sure there's probably something, but I'd probably need another 20 minutes to think of it. Then our
Okay.
time would be done.
That is okay. That's okay. Another question that we got is, in the role of chaplain, is God uh, is God language always a go-to for you, or have you found language that is not alienating to those who do not buy into that language, the God language? What are your resources for providing spiritual care to those who do not believe in a God?
Yeah, this is a great question. So thanks to the questioner. Probably the hardest task for me in the last 20 years since I, have been doing this work very intentionally has been language,
Mhm.
has been finding ways of expressing things that have lost their meaning to the majority and the masses. I even did a series one time called Naughty Words, Knotty. And I had our artist, she drew like geez, it must have been 8 foot by 6 foot knot and like a rope knot, right? But they were actually Naughty words. They were naughty in that it wasn't a straight line, right? It had history. The words had history. The words were like evangelism, stewardship,
Mhm.
mission. I mean, they were just tough words that for many people, they've lost their meaning. So, a large part of what I've spent my life doing in the last 20 years is finding new language to talk about things. So for instance, at the barn, we never talked about mission, we talked about neighbors matter.
Mm.
We didn't call it worship, we called it the gathering. It was the 10-10. That's what we called the gathering, the 10-10 gathering, right? We So I had to find ways to talk about things, and I'd have to ask myself, what is the essence of this word? Look at the history of this word, kind of deconstruct that word. What's the essence of this word? And begin using words that are commonplace in the vernacular to describe these things. Were the words wholly inclusive? No.
Mm.
Does gathering, is that wholly inclusive of worship? No. But does it give you a place to start another conversation? Yes, I think it does. So yes, language is very important. I use very little churchese when I talk these days. I find ways of talking about things that I think are much more inclusive, much more open, much more inviting to people. And I try very hard to stay away from churchies, just like conversation partners. We probably spent 9 hours, 8 of us. How do we describe the people we're having conversations with? Because we wanted it to be equal. You know what I mean? Like all of these things take time and effort so that you can have these conversations without shutting people down before you even get started because you're talking about things like can you imagine me using words like consubstantiation or existential? They don't even know what I'm talking about, right? So to find ways to talk about things, to break it down, to talk about it in simplistic yet challenging ways, deconstruct it and reconstruct it back up. So yes, I think very central to these conversations is invitational language that's constantly inviting people in and hearing when you've done a bad job.
Mm.
Like for instance, I had this expression, okay, so this isn't within church. Well, yeah, I was saying colorblind.
Mm.
And somebody come up to me and said, no, I want to be able to see color. Be color brave, Sue, not
Mm.
colorblind. So you have to be open to hearing, even when you're trying to be more open and inclusive, you have to be able to hear from people that there's even a better way for you to say that, Sue, right? And you have to find out, like, I have a brother that has Down syndrome that's disabled. How do people with challenges before them want to be called? Do they want to be called disabled? Do they want to be called challenged? Do they want to be called up? Right? So talk to the communities that you're talking with and say, how, let them be your teachers. How can I refer to you in a way that is affirming and building you up and not offensive and tearing you down, right? So language is incredibly important. I mean, women, how do we even deal with all the male imagery around God? And then when you try to change it and they're like, oh, well, language isn't important to me, but don't you dare change it. Well, yeah, it is important to you because you don't want me to change it, right? I'm in a place right now where I refer to the Holy Spirit, which is in my tradition, as she all the time now. And the people that I'm working with are like, why do you call it? Well, I said, well, because it's never masculine in our text. It's either feminine or neuter. So I'm going to refer to spirit as she. But see, that opens up the conversation. Does that make sense? That opens up the conversation for people. Why would you refer to something as he that is nowhere he in our sacred text? So
Yes.
anyways, this is the kind of conversation, but you got to be open, right? When you do this language stuff to finding the right words and to the audiences, is it helpful? And if it's not, keep working it until it is.
Mhm. That is so helpful, Sue. I know, for those who have been to seminary or training as chaplains, oftentimes we are trained in our particular religious traditions. And so when we are meeting with people from different, various religious backgrounds or with no particular religious tradition, we come with our language. And so to be able to think about, well, what is the history of that word? And how might this other person be receiving that word or hearing that word? I think it's helpful for us to be humble and say, okay, teach me, how are you hearing that? And so I love to kind of hear even your own process of 40 years of ministry and kind of thinking through how you're using language and how that does, how it can build up a wall or it can actually tear it down. And so thank you for sharing about that. So we
Mhm.
have 5 more minutes, and I would love for you, if very briefly, I know you could probably talk about this for a while, but you talked about the future of church, but I would love for you to think about What do you see as the future of religion?
Mm,
Where do you see religion, religious tradition, spirituality in the next 10, 20 years?
mm. Excellent question. I've thought a lot about this because people invite me to talk about this, right? Because as their churches are closing and diminishing, and by the way, there are two areas that are growing in the United States for people who don't know. Growing, there we go, balloons this time. And that is immigrant communities. And again, when you come here from a different place, one of the ways you find your identity is gathering with the people like you, your tribe, right? And so immigrant communities, and then over time they start to diminish, but initially it's like a place of belonging. And the other is some of the charismatic traditions are growing, but all the rest are diminishing, including the conservative church, which a lot of people don't believe. But yeah, like Willow was like a fifth of what it was. Like a lot of the churches are diminishing. So looking towards the future, I'm really hopeful about the future. I think it's going to look very different. I think it's going to be not big buildings with high performance. I think it's going to be I think churches, synagogues can less and less afford pastors, building, and ministry. And that's what we're doing, right? We're currently saying to a congregation, you have to support your staff, you have to support the building, and you have to support the mission of what we're called to do in our community. And those three things are almost unaffordable today for the average congregation, unless there's some really wealthy donors. And so I think it's not going to be so much about buildings. I think we have emerging generations who want to utilize available resources, like their homes, the places where they work that have like an office space or whatever that they could use in the evening. I think it's going to be less and less about building gigantic multi-million-dollar buildings, and I think it's going to be more about meeting in people's living rooms. And I think it's going to be smaller in nature. I think it's going to be more like family gatherings, like this is my family group, right? This is my chosen family group, and they're going to support and encourage each other. I think it's going to become more there's going to be less division around specific things, like the Methodists believe this, the Episcopals believe this, the Baptists believe this. And even within other, right, like even within Judaism, it's going to be less about the conservatives over here and it's going to be more about bringing us together to some of the commonalities that we share, and that we can hold on to our unique differences, but that we're going to more and more hold on to the some of the larger principles, theology, and understandings that we have. So I think that's going to be one of the big changes moving forward, because emerging generations are much, much, much more open to a larger God,
Mm.
I want to say, instead of a God that has to look a certain way, be a certain way. They are much more open to God being love, and and looking at how different faiths express that love, if that makes sense, right? So Buddhists have found it this way, Christians have found it this way, Jews have found it this way. And so they have much more of a, we talk about it in the book, moralistic therapeutic deism,
Mm.
right? So they're moralistic, they're very therapeutic, and they're deists, but they're more eclectic. They take a little bit from this and a little bit from that and a little bit from this, and they create what it is they believe from a variety of traditions. And that train is out of the station.
Mm.
So I think we need to figure out how do we embrace some of the ways that emerging generations are finding God, and what does that mean for us? And that means some real change is afoot.
Well, I am grateful for your hopeful envisioning of the future of religion and spirituality. And we had somebody in the chat that talked about because of this change, because we're not focusing on buildings or trying to hire specific staff to do all of the ministry in a particular religious institution, chaplaincy is growing. And we're seeing chaplains in circuses. We're seeing chaplains in veterinary offices, we're seeing them in airports. And so we're recognizing that spirituality is growing in places outside of a building. And so I hope the spiritual care providers and the chaplains that have come into this conversation will recognize that what you all are doing is so important. And as Sue talked about, you are creating senses of belonging and caring and authenticity, and you're providing space where people can say, you know what, I want to lean into these big questions of life. And so I'm grateful for Sue and the insight that you have shared with us over your 40 years of ministry. Thank you for your insight, and thank you for creating those spaces for people to connect and feel like they can really be themselves. And so if you all are interested, I know somebody put in the chat box, Hear Us Out, the book. You can purchase it on Amazon. I would encourage you to do so if you want to learn more about the conversation that Sue had and her colleagues. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Sue. Are there any last words that you want to share with us, Sue?
Oh man, we are so privileged to walk alongside people. Get curious, lean in, love well, and God will be seen.
Thank you so much, Sue. Have a wonderful day and hope to see you again. Take care.